Lorax were Finnish, he wouldn't just speak for the trees, but would manage them through a sovereign wealth fund. Forests have always been one of Finland's key sources of strength. It's shaped so much of their economy, their exports, and their way of life. And yet, because of growing biodiversity loss, we now face a new problem. How can Finland continue to sustain an ecosystem that has helped provide it with so much, while also reaping the economic benefits from that? To answer that question, I'm joined by my colleagues of Josephina, Jacqueline, and Robert as we talk about how BWF can catalyze a new era in sustainable finance investing. Now, specifically, the key question that we want to answer today is how can BWF, number one, boost biodiversity while locking in long-term returns? And we're super excited to be able to answer this through our transformative solution called Project Borealis. Now, this solution really hinges on two key pillars. The first one is building a market. Now, what I mean by that is currently we have funds that are willing to invest hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars into biodiversity projects, but currently there is no investment vehicle to turn those dollars into actual projects. And we want to be able to solve that by creating an investment vehicle by co-anchoring and creating a co-investment fund to be able to establish that connection between dollars and projects. Now, initially, this fund is going to invest in current projects that are stable and currently going on, but in the future, what we're really excited about is our opportunity to invest in a new asset. An asset that offers limitless economic and ecological potential, and an asset that no other sovereign wealth fund is currently looking at. What I'm talking about is peatlands, and we want to monetize peatlands through carbon credits and biodiversity credits to create a brand new tradable asset that will be able to unlock a ton of ecological benefits. Overall, from our strategy, we can see over $35 billion in new private investments, in addition to the opportunity to restore up to 33% of Finland's lands back to carbon sinks, with the most important outcome being that BWF will be an industry leader in ecological investing. Now, the first part of our solution centers around Anchor Borealis. And to understand this, let's understand a little bit more about the market. Now, currently, there is about a $900 billion gap between the current investment options for biodiversity projects right now and where they're going to be by 2030, which shows that there is huge unmet demand for these projects. Now, on the supply side, we see that over 75% of Finland is dominated by forests, and the majority of those forest owners have indicated the potential to enter into these investments with our firms. And so you might ask, we have tremendous demand and also tremendous supply. Now, the issue comes from a lack of investment vehicles. There's no investment vehicle big enough to be able to sustain the size and scale that a lot of these asset managers want to invest into biodiversity. The best we have is green bonds, but only 5% of green bonds actually goes towards biodiversity projects. And so why currently don't these projects exist? Well, what I really want to point your attention to is kind of this chicken and egg problem between transparency and liquidity. On the transparency front, a lot of these projects are small and they don't have a standardized KPI or reporting system. And because they're not very transparent, not many people want to invest in them, leading to illiquidity. Because there's illiquidity, there's not very clear market data, leading to even more lack of transparency. And so the key takeaway I want you to take away from this is the idea that we need someone to come in early on, take on that early risk, and establish that transparency and liquidity for this market to really take off. And we want that person to be BWF. Specifically, we want to form the Borealis Tessie Biodiversity Investment Consortium, where we're going to be able to pool our assets and act as anchor investors with Tessie. For those who aren't familiar with Tessie, they're basically a Finland-backed investment company that specializes in green investments. And we want to be the co-anchors to be able to go out, buy all of these scattered projects, standardize the KPI and reporting measures to increase that transparency, and use our balance sheets to increase that liquidity as well. What this actually looks like is initially BWF and Tessie will provide anchor capital and define the KPIs and reporting measures to standardize it across all of our projects. We then want to crowd in. So from case studies from other sovereign wealth funds, we think that we can get up to 4 to 6 times leverage. And from that, we're going to go out and bundle small forestry projects to create this new fund. After that, we want to make sure that we have standardized reporting metrics and continue to verify them with the overarching idea that we can scale not just across Finland, but across the EU as well. Now, we understand that different clients will have different needs. And so we want to introduce a tranche-like feature to be able to appeal to the different risk tolerances of potential private investors that come in with us. Specifically, we have senior, mezzanine, and junior tranches with the overarching idea that we're going to be able to make money through market-making alpha, performance fees, and carry, in addition to the compounding effect as we scale across Europe. So now we've talked about making that market. We're able to actually create that investment vehicle for large asset managers to invest in the biodiversity industry. But so far, we've only looked at stable assets and stable projects that currently exist. Now, Josefina is going to be talking about a brand new asset that we can invest in that has enormous potential.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Finland's carbon emission issue has been traditionally blamed on forestry, but there's actually a core underlying issue here: the damaged peatlands and wetlands that these forests actually lay on. So, traditionally, 30% of Finland's land has actually been peatlands, and half of them have been drained due to forestry. This has led to a 10% contribution to carbon emissions from Finland alone. Overall, contributions to Finland's overall carbon emissions. So this can be one of the greatest opportunities for Finland to actually improve their net zero goals. But if this is such a great ecological opportunity, why have we not tapped into it so far? Well, currently it's just not very financially attractive. It's high cost, costing 5,000 euros per hectare in order to restore. So how do we turn these ecological opportunities into financial ones as well? Well, we don't want to invest in normal restoration. We want to invest in politiculture, rewriting and agriculture on top of these damaged peatlands. Crops such as red canary weeds, as well as different types of cattails, actually thrive in these environments and are able to contribute to the biodiversity as well as the bioeconomy of Finland through different things such as different types of packaging as well as bioenergy feedstock. Overall, this allows us to not only be carbon sensitive, but also generate revenues. And we do this through multiple different ways. First, through different types of carbon offsets, such as these biodiversity credits, as well as carbon credits, and lastly, through that agriculture and the biomass that we mentioned earlier. Overall, we're not only able to save carbon, which we can do by saving 3 to 6 tons of carbon per hectare per year over a 30-year period. We're able to create a way for investors to invest in long-term sustainable green infrastructure over a long period of time. Now, I'll pass it off to Jacqueline to tell us exactly how we can actually do this.
Thank you, Josefina. Note that green bonds are not the most ideal mechanism for dealing with biodiversity. However, it's still a really excellent method for our portfolio to help Finland achieve carbon neutral 2025. How then are we going to evaluate other items in our portfolio then? Introducing our alignment pipeline or our screening pipeline in general, this is to ensure that every euro that goes into our portfolio is able to align with our sustainability and biodiversity goals. In particular, the SFDR regulations apply to public equities and bonds. The Euro taxonomy screening applies to peatland projects, and the TFND will be integrated within our private equity forestry evaluations. How then are we going to evaluate our returns or our ecological returns? Note that the current problem that we face in the status quo is the idea that indexes are typically not too aligned. There's in general just a lack of comparison between indices, and they're not the most ideal way to deal with it. We are building an MRV system, a measurement, reporting, and verification system, initially outsourced, so we can translate ecological returns into proper investable, verifiable returns. Passing it off to Robert to go through the implementation.
Thank you, Jacqueline. In terms of our portfolio allocation, we chose the assets based on our pre-selection framework to make sure that we have stable market returns under all conditions. We also decided to include gold as both an inflation and a systemic risk hedge. We optimized the weights for our portfolio based on the suggested allocations from the SWF's allocation survey from 2024, as well as optimizing it by the Sharpe ratio on top of that. The main risk we identified was climate risk, which we directly factored into our models. For the implementation in the short term, we do like to outsource a lot of the operations that require subject matter experts, and in turn, later on, integrate that internally into our systems.
So just like the Lorax was the first to just like how the Lorax was the first to speak to the trees, we can be the first to invest in them. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for your presentation. Do we have any questions from our judges?
Could we spend a bit of time on portfolio construction to understand what's underlying to your asset allocation?
Yes, of course.
And specifically talking about your allocation to gold.
Our allocation to gold. Okay, perfect. So in terms of our portfolio allocations, they were mainly determined by each of these different, each of our different assets and their historical returns. We chose gold mainly as the inflation and systemic risk hedge because there's a lot of risk already built into our portfolio, so it was mainly meant as a beta risk hedge. If you want, let's go into the equities and as well as into each of these separate asset classes. To calculate our assumptions, we used the 10-year Finnish bond as a risk-free rate and optimized mainly based on the Sharpe ratio with a cap on each of these asset classes based on a suggestion from the IFSWF's allocation surveys with a long-term CPI inflation of around 2%. For the policies for each of these assets, as stated before, we pre-screen them. So the goal is to make sure that the biodiversity targets can be met from the assets that are pre-screened and over time reallocate them based on the metrics that we calculate from the MRV systems. So in terms of assets for equities, and let me just go to gold first to answer your question. In terms of gold, it's just mainly the risk hedge in our models that we calculated based on our value at risk models. In terms of equities, we chose a proxy as the Global Timber Sustainable Equity Index to basically finance to measure our returns from that 8-year historical return. The private equity funding comes from TESI and their current projects on sustainable forestry with their allocations based on geographical allocations as well as the understanding that a lot of their funding comes from private investors, which we want to capitalize upon. For bonds, we decided to filter our bonds by certain criteria for sustainability, backed fixed income, as well as green bonds, because sustainability bonds currently only have 3% of their actual total allocation going towards the actual projects, which would make them not very beneficial towards sustainability projects. And finally, to compare other peers to our current projects, we found that other sustainable funds have relatively similar 5-year return ratios as well as comparable Sharpe ratios.
Maybe just a quick follow-up question. Could you talk to the risk of gold as well as what is underlying to your equity portfolio?
Yes, I guess in terms of the gold aspect of things, I guess the key risk behind that is just like commodity prices and how they are quite separate from how the overall market moves. But I think like that's one of the advantages of our portfolio that we kept in mind is the idea that we've tried to diversify as much as possible, and we understand that through this new investable like peat lens, it's going to probably track how a lot of the carbon cap market is going to move. And so we want to introduce this extra kind of factor to diversify our portfolio a little bit more and reach the Sharpe ratio we wanted.
Stephanie?
Actually, maybe following up on your solution around the new infrastructure co-investment sleeve, can you discuss if you've thought about the cost of implementing that and finding the talent to create that portfolio allocation?
Sure. So the main considerations that we made around the peatland is that it actually has two main purposes. One is the biodiversity purpose, which we want to measure by the actual impact with carbon. The secondary purpose, as well as the funding, which comes from the three different sources. So the biodiversity offsets, which are a much greater market than biodiversity credits, as well as the agriculture, and then as well as the actual carbon credit offsets. So to model that, we actually did a 10-year horizon for estimating that. A lot of this data actually comes from a paper that came out earlier this year, as well as some pilot projects that actually ended in September of this year. So a lot of those projects estimated polluticulture itself at around $3,000 to $6,000 to fund. Although for Finland, because of their wide selection of infrastructure that they can build on, we decided to estimate with around 3,170, which was their mean that they expected. The leverage multiplier actually comes from our assumption that because it's such a risky project, a lot of Finnish private investors may not want to invest as much in the early on stages, so we decided to use a lower leverage multiplier than the industry standard. The carbon impact, we decided to use the lowest benefit possible because we wanted to see, even if we only planted the worst carbon product, if it would actually still help us reach our net neutrality goals. The production for that would be around 9 tons per hectare per year, the sale price around 1,700. So in our different cases, we worked out that the IRR would be around 9.8% to around 10% for these projects. And we did a scenario analysis on each of these and determined that the net carbon emissions in the worst case would still reduce the overall emissions by around 11 million tons. And that's assuming a 20% growth rate in the carbon emissions, but that's a bit unrealistic based on our projections from the current emissions from that market. In terms of the mean, it was around breaking even so that Finland's no longer a net sink or a net source. And finally, for the best case scenario, where we have a lot of funding, a lot of people invested into this asset class, we'd have around a negative 7 million tons of carbon per year, reaching around the same level that Finland was at before 2020, around there. Yeah.
Great. John Sebastian?
Maybe a follow-up to this. So just to clarify, in the portfolio allocation, the 15% in peatlands is basically just this project? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then I think in the presentation you spoke about high upfront costs of $5,000 per hectare. Like, how come here you have a lower assumption?
So that is actually the interesting part because projects from before mainly focused around peatland restoration. So the peatland restoration process is actually different from the polluticulture projects. So the polluticulture products are really, really recent. They came out around 2 years ago. They started their pilots in Scotland as well as Ireland. So they're now currently in their scaling phase for increasing the revenues into the funding into the projects. In terms of peatland restoration, Finland itself tried the peatland restoration projects and found them unscalable earlier on in around 2022. So that's why we chose not to do peatland restoration, because it's very hard to make an asset class out of that, rather than an asset class out of the agriculture that comes out of those polluticulture products.
Okay, got it. Interesting. And how come it's cheaper than for us that are not well versed in this?
Yeah.
You'd think like doing something like this sounds more expensive than pure restoration. Can you walk us through maybe the rationale here?
Yeah, so it's generally cheaper to do polluticulture because of the cost savings. So in peatland restoration, you actually have to go in and re-wet these lands. But for polluticulture, you don't have to do that. You go on top of these damaged peatlands and plant the crops on top of them. And these crops are already native to Finland, so you don't have to worry about the climate risk and all those things that are associated with it. So you're able to just go in and help restore them without doing the re-wetting, which is what costs the most. So it's that cost saving that allows us to do this so cheaply. And on top of that, we get benefits from being able to sell those in the bioeconomy.
And then one more follow-up. Can you like the BBIC, can you help me place it in your allocation as well? Like it says it's a $6 billion cost. Where does it sit in the asset allocation?
So the BBIC mainly is talking about the structure and how we want to invest in private equity as well as these infrastructure funds. So it's not it's less of a actual asset, but it's more of like the methodology we want to approach when we approach both the private equity and forestry, as well as this peatland infrastructure, which requires it a lot. A lot of the private equity forestry issues come from how sustainable forestry infrastructure, although it's a rapidly growing asset class, there's still a lot of inherent risk in the sustainable forestry for the supply chains. And for peatlands, it's more so where sustainable forestry is a mitigation strategy to the biodiversity loss, while the peatlands are more sort of a restoration to those biodiversity losses.
And the anchor that you mentioned, the $6 billion, what is this? Is this equity? Is this like where is it? Like it's obviously it's a part of BWF's assets. Where does it then sit in the asset allocation?
So it's currently projected in our private equity forestry allocation, in addition to the infrastructure direct investments, as well as part of the green bonds.
Jean-Sébastien.
Awesome. Going back to slide 17 on the portfolio construction, you have provided some thoughts as to the impact of gold on mitigating market risk, but I'd like to also hear you on concentration risk, especially concentration to Finland. So how do you assess that risk, decide to accept it, and or mitigate it within your portfolio structure?
So we came into this project with the mindset that the goal of the fund is to revitalize Finland's forestry economy. And without a decent exposure to the Finland forestry economy, it's impossible to actually provide substantial impact on that. So the main reason why a lot of our infrastructure for peatlands is directly allocated to forestry, it's directly allocated to Finland, as well as part of our PE, private equity for forestry, is also allocated to Finland, is due to that reason. Our equities are global, our green bonds are global. So most of our portfolio is well diversified in global economies. Also, when we modeled out the situations, we modeled based on the allocations that we found from the allocation surveys.
And in summary, what would be the percentage of allocation that would be dedicated to Finland?
So the allocation for Finland is around 35%.
Thank you.
Leslie.
Thanks for your presentation. Can you talk a little bit about the transition phase, like how we get from the current portfolio to your target portfolio?
I guess back to the idea of like having a scaled approach. So first we see that although green bonds don't offer the best in terms of biodiversity targets, they also help a lot with our climate targets, and they're something that we can do right away. And so we want to start by transitioning with the most liquid assets. Then in terms of the actual BBIC projects, we want to start with actual projects in Finland that are going on right now. So for example, like monoculture tree farming restoration, things like that. So like projects that we can get that are very stable, that we know work, and that are in Finland. And then in the next couple of years, we want to start transitioning more towards that peatland with that phased approach.
Do you have any last questions? I guess we're good. Thank you so much, and round of applause.